Welcome back. At this point, we're going to be making a major transition in the course in terms of level of organization, going down from the molecular cell organelle levels of organization up to the tissue, organ systems, and up to the organismal level of organization. So in the last class, we talked about the origin of multicellularity. We talked about some of the benefits of multicellularity in terms of having an advantage for predation or avoiding predation, and also in the increase in complexity that is allowed by having differentiation of different cell types, different tissue types. And we also discussed many of the challenges that arise with having larger body size, a larger multicellular body, especially in terms of surface area to volume ratios, being able to get needed materials to the interiors of relatively large bodies. And so now we're going to start to look at the different tissues and organ systems that allow these challenges to be overcome and also take advantage of the benefits of having specialized cells that do particular jobs in an organism. So we're going to start out with plants and thinking about what are plants and what are the major functions that they all share in common. So first of all, as we know, plants make their own food through photosynthesis using the energy from sunlight and converting that energy into carbohydrates that can be stored and then later metabolized into ATP for their cellular processes. Plants generally don't move around very much, so they're anchored to the soil. They stay in one place, extending their roots and shoots to harvest diffuse resources both from the soil and from the atmosphere and from the sun. The structure of a plant's body is dynamic. Although they don't move around, they can respond, as do all living things, to things going on in their environment. And because plants can grow throughout their lives and exhibit what we call indeterminate growth, there's no limit to the growth they can undergo. This means that they can use differential growth of their bodies to respond to the environment rather than moving and responding to their environment. In this web lecture and also continuing on into the next one, we're going to look at three fundamental questions. And this is going to focus on one particular group of plants, the flowering plants, known as the angiosperms. So first of all, in this web lecture in particular, we're going to be looking at how are plant bodies organized? What are the levels of organization and what are the different cell types, tissue types, and organ systems that compose a plant body? Secondly, why are plants so diverse in size and shape? So we'll think of that in this web lecture in terms of specializations for different functions and responses to environmental pressures. And then finally, in the next web lecture, we're going to think about how do plants grow throughout their lives? How can they use this growth to respond to the environment, and how does the growth actually happen? So first of all, let's look at the hierarchical organization of plant bodies. Plants, as well as all multicellular organisms, have a hierarchical organization consisting of organs, tissues, and cells. So plants have organs composed of different tissues, which in turn are composed of different cell types. So we know that the cell is the fundamental unit of life. That's the smallest thing that can be considered in and of itself alive. And in a multicellular organism, we have tissues, which are groups of cells consisting of one or more cell types that together perform a specialized function. So these tissues, in turn, can be organized into organs. So an organ consists of several types of tissues that together carry out specific functions. And then these organs are organized into organ systems. The organ systems comprise the organism's body. So what are the different things that plants need to do? What are the functions that these structures need to accomplish? So first of all, plants use light energy to synthesize carbohydrates from carbon dioxide in the air and water from the soil. So we've learned about this with photosynthesis, but now we're going to think about the fact that these materials are coming from the air and from the soil, respectively. How do we get these things together? How does the plant body organize to be able to do that? Plants must also obtain nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, magnesium, and other nutrients, the building blocks for all of these macromolecules that make up their bodies. And so this is another major function that plants must perform. And these key elements that they need to absorb exist in nature primarily as ions dissolved in soil water. So this is going to be connected with the taking up of water for the purpose of photosynthesis. So we have two major organ systems when we think about plants. So there's the below ground system. This is the root system that's going to have a couple of functions. It's going to anchor the plant in place, and it also is going to be specialized for absorbing water and nutrients from the soil. And then there's an above ground organ system, the shoot system, that is going to be specialized for harvesting light, so taking in as many photons as possible from the sunlight, and also taking in carbon dioxide from the air to produce sugars. So together, these systems make up the plant body. These are the two major organ systems that make up the plant body. So to summarize this, we've got the above ground system that is primarily for gathering photons and carbon dioxide. There's the below ground system, the root system, that gathers water and dissolved nutrients, and then we need to have a connecting system between the two that's going to bring the water up to the leaves for photosynthesis, and then that's going to transport the sugars that are made throughout the plant. And so there's going to be a connection between these two organ systems. Transport of water, sugar, and nutrients is going to happen through a particular tissue called vascular tissue. So in both of these systems, the root and shoot system, we see again the importance of the surface area to volume ratio. So now let's think a little bit about how plants overcome the decrease in surface area to volume as their body size becomes larger. So root and shoot systems both function in absorption. So roots absorb water and key nutrients. Shoots absorb light, and the amount of absorption they can do is going to depend on the amount of surface area. This is all going to happen through the surface. So absorption takes place across a surface, but the cells that use that absorbed light and molecules occupy a particular volume. You have to be able to supply enough of these materials to supply the entire volume of the plant. So a plant is efficient in absorption if it has a large surface area relative to its volume. So if we think of different structures in a plant, so this is a tuber, which is specialized for storage of plant materials. It doesn't really matter so much about having a large surface area for this function, and so we see kind of a short round shape that has a pretty minimal surface area to volume ratio. But when we look at the surfaces that are specialized for absorption, so first one of the modifications that we see in the root system for increasing that surface area to volume ratio is the elongation of these long skinny fibers that are going to come out and spread out through the soil to be able to maximize that surface area to volume ratio, to be able to maximize the absorption. So you see, if we take the same volume and spread it out over a long, narrow structure, we're going to get a much larger surface area to volume ratio just from that change in shape. So similarly with leaves, now not only do we need to maximize the surface, but we also want to be able to orient that surface toward the source of the light. So the best shape for this function is a broad flat shape as opposed to a long thin shape, so that this broad flat surface can be directed toward the source of the sunlight to be able to gather as many photons as possible. So again, we're maximizing the surface area to volume ratio, but we're doing it in a broad flattened structure that's going to capture as many photons from the sun as possible. So now let's look at the functions of the root system in more detail. So there are many key functions of the root system. One is that they're going to anchor the plant to the soil. We need to maintain that connection to the soil to be able to absorb water, and so we need to make sure that these plants are not being pulled up from the soil. So the roots are going to be an anchoring system to keep that connection. And then, of course, as we've mentioned, they're going to be an absorption surface, absorbing ions and water from the soil. Roots can also be specialized as storage structures that are going to accumulate the materials, the carbohydrates, the starches that are produced in the shoot system by photosynthesis. They can be transported down to the roots where they can be stored below ground, somewhat protected from other organisms that might want to partake of those stored nutrients. So many root systems have a taproot, which is the main anchoring root, and also lateral roots that are going to spread out and serve that absorption function. Although root systems are built from the same set of structures, the same general structures, we can have a great deal of diversity in root systems. So let's first think about the function of anchoring. Tall plants with large shoot masses generally have a taproot system. The taller the plant is, the better anchored it needs to be because of the leverage of a tall plant. It makes it much easier to pull that plant out of the soil. So you're going to have a much larger, deeper taproot system in tall plants. And so the taproot generally develops from the primary root and is going to be the main anchor for the plant. So you see this long, thick taproot that's going to be the main anchor for the plant. But small or trailing plants are going to be much easier to pull out from the soil, especially by herbivores, animals that are going to be eating them. And so they need a more spread out, fibrous root system that's going to distribute that anchoring and better enable these smaller plants to stay in place. This is going to spread out like a thick mat below the soil surface, although herbivores may be able to come and consume the shoots from these plants. These roots are going to be very difficult to completely pull up from the soil, and so the root system will still be there and be able to regenerate those plants. Now thinking about the function of absorption. Absorption primarily occurs at the tips of the lateral roots. So the lateral roots are the ones that are really specialized for this absorption function. Often we have a very elaborate expansion of these lateral root systems. So the lateral roots will have on them these root hairs, these little finger-like extensions of epidermal cells that are going to form near the root tip and vastly increase that absorptive surface of the root. So you can see all of these tiny little hairs that are going to increase that surface area by orders of magnitude over what the lateral root itself could do. Also, to increase this absorption function, most root systems form what we call mycorrhizal associations, so symbiotic relationships with fungi that are very specialized to form these very long, very fine, fibrous extensions that are very, very good at absorbing. So the plant provides some protection, some anchoring for these mycorrhizae, these little fungal symbionts, and the symbionts in exchange are going to help with the absorption function of these roots, especially in many species, nitrogen fixation. So plants generally cannot absorb nitrogen directly from the atmosphere. That nitrogen has to be fixed to an organic molecule before a plant can use it. And many times it's these mycorrhizae that are doing that job for the plant. And so we see a lot of diversity and a lot of specialization in these root systems, and this can be very nicely seen in assemblages of prairie plants, so different species of prairie plants living together. So prairies are grassland ecosystems that support many herbaceous plants, so mostly ground plants as opposed to woody trees and things. So these are going to be primarily grasslands. And the root systems of these prairie grasses are perennial. They're adapted for surviving fire or drought and then being able to regenerate the next year. So a new shoot system is produced each spring or after a fire, but these root systems are adapted to stay in place to be able to regenerate those parts in the following year. So as we can see, there's lots of diversity among these different prairie plants that are living together, and this diversity allows them to share this space but be able to divide up the resources, so minimize the competition for water and resources by being at different depths in the soil. They're going to utilize different water sources, and having different kinds of either taproots or fibrous root systems it's going to allow them to share that space in a more beneficial way. So these roots can also be modified in different ways for specialized functions. So by various types of plants, we're going to have different modifications in the roots. So one form of modification is something called adventitious roots. So the term adventitious applies to anything that's growing where it normally doesn't grow. So normally these lateral roots would grow out of the primary roots. In an adventitious root system, the roots grow from the stems, from the shoot system. And so this can be seen in this example with ivy. It's growing, the stems are growing up along a surface, and it sends out these little adventitious roots to help anchor it to the surface that it's climbing up. We can also see adventitious roots in prop roots that are adapted for helping to spread out the space of support in a very tall plant to help keep it from toppling over. So that's what these prop roots do, for example, in a corn plant. So we can also see these specializations in roots that are not adventitious, that are growing in the normal way. And so mangroves produce specialized roots called pneumatophores for gas exchange. So they're generally in oxygen-poor environments, so they want to get some of their roots up into the air where they can collect up oxygen and allow gas exchange in this kind of murky, oxygen-poor environment where mangroves grow. And roots can also be modified for storage of starches, carbohydrates, so things such as sugar beets, carrots, all the root vegetables that we like to eat are basically modified taproots that have been expanded and used for carbohydrate storage. So now let's take a look at the shoot system. So the shoot system has many anatomical features. These are most of the structures that you typically associate with plants, but let's go into a little bit of the detail. Most of you are probably familiar with the idea of stems. That is the main support of the plant, but the stems are divided into different components. There are the nodes, which are the parts of stems from which leaves grow. So these are the leaf attachment sites. And then the segments of stem in between the nodes are called internodes. So these are the segments between the nodes. These are the parts that are responsible for elongation of the plant, for increasing the height. We also have a couple of different systems of buds that can give rise either to branches or flowers. And so axillary or lateral buds form at the nodes. So this little junction between a leaf and the stem is where you can get growth of axillary buds. So an axillary bud may grow into a branch, as we see here, a branch coming out of this axillary bud. And the tip of each stem and branch contains an apical bud. So here's one at the tip of the main stem. Here's one at the tip of a branch. And both these apical and axillary buds can develop into flowers. So here we have a flower coming from an axillary bud. This is coming out of a node. This is the main apical bud of the plant. So the primary function of the stem is to elongate the plant, so to get it up closer to the sun, elevate it into the atmosphere, and also to be able to grow in such a way that these leaves are going to be oriented with respect to the sun in a way that maximizes the capture of photons. So stems, like roots, can have specialized functions in addition to this primary function of gaining height. So, for example, cactus stems are modified to store water and also to perform photosynthesis. Remember, cacti are living in these hot and dry climates. The leaves are a big source of water loss. So in cacti, the leaves are minimized and the photosynthesis occurs primarily through the stem with minimized surface area for water loss. Stolons are modified stems that grow horizontally along the surface of the ground. These are also known as runners. This is an example of a strawberry plant, and these stolons can run along the ground, and when it gets away from the main plant, send out adventitious roots to create another individual plant. So a whole field of strawberries could actually have come from a single individual sending out these runners and reproducing asexually. Stems can also be adapted into structures called rhizomes. So rhizomes are stems that grow horizontally and again are going to function in asexual reproduction, sending out adventitious roots to form separate individual plants. So tubers are similar to the taproots that are specialized for food storage, only tubers are modified stems rather than modified roots. So these are underground, swollen rhizomes. So these kinds of structures, imagine these getting blown up with lots of stored starches to form storage organs. So these are things such as potatoes that are actually modified stems rather than modified roots. And then finally, thorns are modified stems that create these spiky structures that help to protect the plant from herbivorous predators. So the other major organ in the shoot system is, of course, the leaf. So the vast majority of photosynthesis occurs in the leaves. These are highly specialized structures for capturing sunlight. So the leaf's relatively large surface area is available for absorbing photons and supporting photosynthesis. They also provide a very large surface area for absorbing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So a simple leaf, such as the one pictured here on the left, has two main structures. There's the expanded blade. This is the large surface that's specialized for photosynthesis, and a stalk that connects it to the stem, and this stalk is called a petiole. We can also have compound leaves, such as the next two seen in this image, in which the blade is divided into a series of leaflets. This whole structure is actually a single leaf that's just been subdivided into many small little leaflets. And we also see needle-like leaves on things like pine and fir trees that are going to decrease that broadened, flattened area, and in that way minimize water loss while still being able to have a large surface area for photosynthesis. So this decreases the extent to which that surface can be specifically oriented toward the source of light, but it also reduces the loss of water. So in addition to this morphological diversity in terms of the subdivision and the shape of the leaves, the arrangement of leaves on a stem can also vary. Leaves can be alternate, so we call these alternate leaves, in which case at every node the leaf is going to come off from a different side of the stem. So this one is coming off to the right, the next one will come off to the left, and they'll alternate node by node which side of the stem they're on. We can also have opposite leaves. So these at each node have two leaves coming off in opposite directions from the same node. Leaves can also be arranged in a whorl, so you have a series of a little circlet of leaves coming from each node, forming a whorl of leaves. And also these inner nodes can be reduced and become very, very short, and that's going to lead to a whole rosette of leaves clustered together on a very, very short stem, and we call this a rosette. Leaves can also be modified for specific functions other than photosynthesis, so they can also be used to store nutrients, and we see this in things like onion bulbs. These are actually modified leaves with a very, very shortened stem, so this is a highly compact rosette-type structure with all of these leaves coming out of it to form this nutrient storage structure. Leaves can also be used to store water in succulent plants such as cacti and aloe vera, so a similar function to what we saw in cacti with the stem. Tendrils that allow plants to climb onto other structures. So plants called vines are going to use these tendrils, which are modified leaves, to wrap around support structures and be able to climb and get their leaves up closer to the sun. Poinsettias we usually think of as flowers, but these red structures are actually leaves. The flowers are tiny little reduced non-showy flowers in the center of these bunches of leaves. And so these red leaves in poinsettias serve the purpose of attracting pollinators to these tiny little flowers in the center of them. Some plants also produce traps for insects. So there's some plants that need to get their nitrogen from animal tissues, and so they form these little traps for insects. The insect is going to be attracted to this hood and fall down into this water-containing tube-like structure, and this tube is a set of modified leaves that have been modified into this tube to trap the insect. And then finally, spines. Unlike thorns, which are modified stems, the spines that you see in cactus are actually modified leaves that protect the stem. So again, these leaves are reduced to reduce water loss and are specialized into protective structures. So those are the main organ systems and organs of a plant. Now let's take a look at the tissue systems. And so within these tissue systems, we're going to be talking about the specialized kinds of cells that make up those tissues. So we're going to talk about the specialized cells in conjunction with the tissues in which they're found. So plant tissues are grouped into tissue systems based on their structural features and locations within the plant. So they're going to have some kind of common function. And so we can have two different kinds of tissues: simple tissues that are made up of a single cell type, and then complex tissues that are going to contain several cell types. Each tissue system is going to be continuous throughout the plant, so they're going to traverse the different organ systems, the shoot system and the root system. So here we see these continuous tissue systems going between the root system and the shoot system. And the three main tissue systems that are found in plants are the dermal tissue system. So these are going to form the exterior of the plant. So if we look at this color coding in this figure, the dermal tissue is in blue, covering the whole outside of the plant. There's a ground tissue system, which is sort of in the middle. This is the color coded in yellow. So we can see in the stem, we've got ground tissue making up the bulk of that stem. We see it providing most of the structure in the interior of the leaf, this yellow portion. And then finally, we have the vascular tissue system, color-coded here in purple, and that's going to sort of run up and down the plant and spread out into the leaves. This is going to be the bulk transport system that we talked about when we were thinking about the challenges of multicellularity. And so this is color-coded in purple, so we can see main passageways for these materials that spread out into each of the cells of the leaf, and then modified for up and down transport in the stem, and then they may form a single main conduit down in the root system. So first let's take a look at the dermal tissue system. So dermal tissue is made up of several different cell types, and so this is one of the complex tissues. So first of all, we have epidermal cells that are going to cover and protect the surface of the plant. And these epidermal cells are going to secrete a waxy substance that's sort of water resistant, and this is called the cuticle, to reduce water loss and protect against pathogens. So this is going to help with regulation of water. But as we know, we need to get materials in and out of the plant. So we need to have some openings within this waxy cuticle. And those are provided, as we saw when we were looking at photosynthesis, by these structures called stomata. So these are going to regulate gas exchange, allow carbon dioxide to come in, allow the oxygen that's being produced to come out in a way that minimizes water loss. And remember, these are adaptable structures that can be closed during times when water loss is excessive, hot, dry circumstances, and opened to allow that gas exchange. And the cells involved with these stomata are called guard cells. So there's one on either side of the stoma, and these can be either filled with water to plump them up and open up that opening, or have water moved out of them to allow them to relax and come together. Another epidermal cell that we see are cells called trichomes. So these perform an array of functions. So trichomes are hair-like appendages made up of specialized epidermal cells that perform several functions. They keep the plant surface cool by reflecting sunlight. They can reduce water loss by limiting transpiration. They can provide little structures called barbs. They can also produce toxins that are going to protect the plant from herbivores. And they can also be sticky and produce digestive enzymes. So in those plants that produce the little traps for insects, these are the cells that are going to cause them to stick to the inside of those traps and also produce the digestive enzymes that are going to digest the insects. Now looking at the vascular tissue system. The vascular tissue system is specialized for facilitating the transport of materials. So this is that bulk transport system that we always need when we get to large body size, and it's going to transport these materials throughout the plant to every cell in the plant. And they're also going to provide the mechanical support that's needed, especially by land-dwelling plants, to be able to remain upright and not just kind of flop over on the ground. So the two vascular tissues are called xylem and phloem. So xylem is the water-conducting system, so it's going to conduct water and dissolved minerals upward from the roots into the shoots. So this is the elevator up, bringing the water up to the leaves to perform photosynthesis. Phloem transports sugars from where they're made, primarily in the leaves, to the storage structures or the sites of growth. So this is going to be transporting those sugars throughout the plant, but specifically also to these usually below ground storage structures. The vascular tissue within a root or stem is collectively called the stele, and in angiosperms, the stele of the root is condensed into the solid central core that is known as the vascular cylinder. The stele of stems and leaves is divided into these vascular bundles. Remember, these need to spread out throughout the structure to be able to reach every cell. And these vascular bundles are composed of strands of xylem and phloem. So let's take a look at the structure of xylem, this water-conducting system. So xylem is a complex tissue, which means it contains more than one kind of cell type. So it contains water-conducting cells, parenchyma cells, and fibers. So remember, this is both a water-conducting tissue. It also contributes to the support of the plant, allowing it to stand upright against gravity. So that's where those parenchyma cells and fibers come into play. So there are two types of these water-conducting cells. The xylem of all vascular plants contains tracheids. So these are elongated, tubular-shaped cells that have little pits along the length of them that allow materials to pass in and out of them. In angiosperms, xylem also contains different kinds of cells called vessel elements. So these differ from tracheids in being shorter but sort of stacked on top of each other. And again, these also have perforations to allow materials to pass. And then they also have these perforated end plates that allow water to be conducted from one vessel member to the next as it moves up through this tube. So both of these kinds of water-conducting cells are actually dead at maturity. So these cells are reinforced not only with cellulose in the cell wall, but also a material called lignin that's going to give these structures some strength. And tracheids and vessels are often found together in the vascular tissue of angiosperms, these flowering plants. So here we see these vessel elements kind of short, separated by these perforated end plates that move up. So these are a lot larger in diameter than the tracheids. The tracheids they're smaller in diameter and longer in length than the vessel elements. Now let's look at the phloem structure. So phloem is a complex tissue containing two types of specialized cells. So they're the sieve-tube elements that form the actual tube. They're long, thin cells with perforated end plates called sieve plates. So unlike the tracheids and vessel elements, these sieve-tube elements are actually living cells when they're functional, but their cytoplasm is highly reduced to create this channel in the middle, so there are very few organelles. So these sieve-tube elements are accompanied by companion cells that maintain the cytoplasm and plasma membrane of the sieve-tube elements. So basically all of the life processes are happening in these companion cells. They're going to be connected to the sieve-tube cells by plasmodesmata, where they're going to exchange materials that are going to keep those sieve-tube cells alive. So sieve-tube elements lack nuclei and are directly connected to these adjacent companion cells by plasmodesmata. So here we have in this illustration the sieve tubes and their companion cells. These are those perforated end plates where materials can pass through from one to the other. And in cross section, here we have a companion cell, a sieve plate, and then these companion cells adjacent to exchange materials. So now the ground tissue system. So remember, this is sort of the in-between tissue between the dermis and the vascular system. And these are sort of the workhorse cells. So most photosynthesis and carbohydrate storage takes place in the ground tissue system. So ground tissue internal to the vascular tissue is called pith, and ground tissue that's external to the vascular tissue is called cortex. And ground tissue is a complex tissue made of three distinct kinds of tissues: parenchyma cells, collenchyma cells, and sclerenchyma cells. So let's take a look at what each of these kinds of cells do. So parenchyma consists of just the workhorse cells. These are doing most of the business of the plant, the metabolic processes, the photosynthesis. So parenchyma is a simple tissue, a single cell type. We just call them parenchyma cells, and they have relatively thin primary cell walls, and they are the most abundant and versatile plant cells. So in leaves, parenchyma tissue is the primary site of photosynthesis, so the mesophyll is made up of parenchyma cells. The bundle sheath is made up of parenchyma cells that are carrying out photosynthetic activity. In roots, parenchyma cells are going to be the ones that store starches for later use by the plant. Many parenchyma cells are what we call totipotent. So think of this as being the stem cells of plants, and they retain the capacity to divide and develop into different cell types to form a complete plant. So this is the reason that the plant can heal wounds if something happens to it. These are the cells that allow healing to occur, and it also allows the plant to reproduce asexually, to be able to sort of sprout out parts of its body from this parenchyma and produce another complete plant. And this is also what allows gardeners to grow entire plants from cuttings. So when you share plants with each other by giving a cutting, it's basically these parenchyma cells that give the plant the capacity to regenerate the rest of the plant. So what happens is these parenchyma cells form a mass of undifferentiated cells. Think of these as the stem cells of the plant, and this mass is called a callus. And so when this callus is planted in the soil, it develops roots from these undifferentiated cells, and then the new individual can be planted and it will regenerate the entire plant. So now let's think about collenchyma. Collenchyma functions primarily in shoot support. So collenchyma is a simple tissue consisting of just collenchyma cells. And these collenchyma cells have unevenly thickened primary cell walls, and they provide flexible structural support. So they're not going to be particularly rigid because they need to allow growth in these actively growing parts of the plant, so they're going to be firm but flexible. Collenchyma is often found just under the epidermis of stems, especially outside of vascular bundles. So as an example, here in a cross-section through celery stalk, if we zoom in on this little region, so these dots are the vascular bundles. And of course this is the dermis along the outside, so we're seeing a little bit of this vascular bundle in this image. And if we zoom in on this little bundle of collenchyma cells, this is what they look like close up, just these bundles of flexible but relatively rigid structural cells. So the last kind of tissue that contributes to the ground tissue system is sclerenchyma. So there are two types of specialized support cells, so this makes this a complex tissue type. The cells of sclerenchyma tissue have a thin primary wall and a very thick, rigid secondary cell wall. So these, like the tracheids and vessel elements that we saw in the xylem, are reinforced by this protein called lignin that's very tough and rigid. So in addition to the cellulose, so these are specialized for structural support. So sclerenchyma is a complex tissue with two types of cells. One are these elongated fiber cells that are going to give the plant great tensile strength. So if you pull on it, that's what gives it the strength to not break when it's pulled on. And so here's a cross-section through these elongated cells. And then the other kind of sclerenchyma cell are sclerids. And these are short, more complex shaped and variable shapes, and function in various forms of protection. So what are the difference between these sclerenchyma and collenchyma cells? They both function in structural support. So remember that collenchyma cells have expandable primary cell walls. These are going to be associated more with growing regions of the plant. So they need to offer some support, but also be flexible enough to accommodate growth. Sclerenchyma cells are dead at maturity, so these are going to be the structural framework of the plant, and they're going to function to support stems and other structures after growth has ceased. So these no longer need to be living cells because they're non-growing portions of the plant, and they can just be the architecture, the structure of the plant. So to wrap up this web lecture, I want to just go back to those initial questions that we posed at the very beginning of this web lecture and see sort of where we are on this. So we looked a lot at how the plant body is organized at the organ system level, the organ level, and the tissue level, and even the cell level, the cell differentiation. And we also saw a lot of the evolutionary pressures that have led to diversity in these different organ systems. So in the next web lecture, what we're going to do is think about the growth of these plants and how the development and the growth leads to this diversity in size and shape, and also how this growth happens. How do we get growth as a response to environmental conditions, and also growth just in terms of the development of the plant.